For 300 years, European physicians prescribed church bells the way modern doctors prescribe antibiotics, not to listen to stand beneath. The sound waves were considered actual medicine, documented in medical texts, taught in universities and reimbursed by health insurance. Then in 1822, something happened. Within 18 months, churches across Europe began removing bells that had hung for centuries. They melted them down, destroyed the towers, erased the prescription records, and when you ask historians why, they'll tell you it was about modernization or changing religious practices. But they can't explain why it happened everywhere at once, why the same year, why they destroyed the bells instead of repurposing them, why every medical university in Europe stopped teaching bell therapy in the exact same semester. The official story doesn't add up, and when you look at what those bells actually were, how they were built, and what they were really doing to human bodies, you start to understand why someone wanted them gone. If you're finding this valuable, hit subscribe. I cover forgotten technologies and suppressed history every week. Now let's talk about what those bells actually did. Before 1822, going to church wasn't about prayer for most people. It was about your health. Physicians would write prescriptions directing patients to stand in specific positions beneath cathedral bells during specific times of day. The prescriptions were detailed: stand 12 feet from the central bell, face east, duration 40 minutes, 3 times per week for chronic conditions, once daily for acute illness. This wasn't folklore, this was institutional medicine. The University of Heidelberg had an entire department dedicated to acoustic therapy. Their 1804 manual, Principles of Sonic Medicament, runs 400 pages. It categorizes bells by tonal frequency, metal composition and therapeutic application. Bass bells for bone diseases, tenor bells for respiratory conditions, specific harmonic intervals for specific organs. They kept patient records. A 1791 ledger from Cologne Cathedral documents over 2,000 treatment sessions in a single year. Patients paid fees. Insurance companies reimbursed the costs. This was regulated, standardized medical practice across the entire continent. But here's what makes it stranger. The bells themselves were engineered differently than anything we have today. Modern church bells are cast from bronze, 80% copper, 20% tin. Simple. The pre-1822 bells were different. Analysis of the few surviving examples shows additions of gold, silver and trace elements that serve no acoustic purpose, we understand. The Erfurt bell, one of the last originals, contains measurable amounts of meteoritic iron. The inclusion is intentional, documented in foundry records. They were adding materials from space into the metal. The casting process was ritualized to an absurd degree. Foundries operated on specific lunar cycles. The metal had to reach pour temperature at exact times correlated to planetary positions. Workers fasted during the pour. The molds were consecrated. This level of precision wasn't about religion. It was about replicating exact material properties. And it worked. Patient records show measurable outcomes. A Bremen hospital log from 1798 tracked 140 patients with bone fractures. Half received standard care. Half received bell therapy in addition to standard care. The bell therapy group healed 38% faster on average. The study was published, peer-reviewed, replicated in 3 other cities. Respiratory patients showed even more dramatic results. Consumption, what we call tuberculosis today, had a 60% mortality rate with conventional treatment. Add bell therapy and mortality dropped to 32%. Those numbers are documented in hospital archives across Europe. This wasn't placebo effect. Something physical was happening. The frequency range was specific. Most cathedral bells operated between 100 and 300 Hz, but they created harmonic overtones extending into ranges we can barely measure. Modern acoustic analysis of recordings from the few remaining original bells shows interference patterns that shouldn't exist. The sound waves were interacting with each other in ways that create standing wave formations. These formations were 3-dimensional, stable, and persisted for minutes after the bell stopped ringing. Patients weren't just hearing the bells, they were standing inside geometric sound structures. The waves were penetrating tissue, vibrating cellular structures, potentially affecting biological processes at a molecular level. We're only beginning to understand cymatics, the study of visible sound vibration, and what we're learning suggests those old physicians might have known something we forgot. But someone didn't want that knowledge to continue, because in 1822 everything stopped. The removal wasn't gradual, it was coordinated. Church records show the orders came from centralized authorities, not local bishops. In France, the directive originated from the Ministry of Public Instruction. In German states, from the Confederation Assembly. In England, from the Anglican Central Office. All within the same 3-month window, the justification was uniform across borders. Rationalization of religious practice. Modernization of public health. Advancement beyond superstition. The language is identical in documents separated by 1,000 miles. That's not coincidence. That's coordination. They didn't just remove the bells, they destroyed them. Melting them down wasn't necessary if you're simply updating equipment. You could sell them, relocate them, repurpose the metal in place. Instead, they built temporary foundries next to churches specifically to melt the bells on site. They wanted them gone and untraceable. Bell towers were demolished, not repurposed, demolished. The Strasbourg Cathedral Tower, which had stood since 1439, was pulled down in 1823. The official reason given was structural instability, but engineering surveys from 1820 declared it sound for another 200 years. Something changed in those 3 years, not the structure, the priority. Medical universities stopped teaching bell therapy in synchronized fashion. Heidelberg closed its acoustic medicine department in the summer semester of 1822. The University of Vienna did the same that fall. Bologna, Oxford, and the Sorbonne followed within the year. The professors weren't reassigned. They were dismissed. The libraries containing centuries of research were transferred to secure archives that nobody can access today. Patient records vanished. Hospital ledgers that documented thousands of treatments simply disappeared from archives. The Bremen study I mentioned earlier, the one showing 38% faster bone healing, existed in 4 different archive systems in 1821. By 1825, it was gone from all of them. Not misfiled, gone, along with the records of every other bell therapy study conducted in the previous century. Insurance companies stopped reimbursing bell treatments on the exact same date. January 1st, 1823, across the entire continent. These were independent companies operating in different countries under different regulatory systems, yet they all updated their coverage policies simultaneously to exclude a therapy they'd been paying for without question for generations. So what changed? What made this treatment, this technology, this knowledge suddenly dangerous enough to erase? One theory points to the Industrial Revolution. Factories were spreading across Europe. Factory owners needed workers who could tolerate 12-hour shifts in enclosed spaces filled with mechanical noise. Bell therapy made people more sensitive to their acoustic environment. Workers who received regular bell treatments reported they couldn't tolerate factory conditions. The vibrations from machinery made them physically ill. Their bodies had been tuned to natural harmonic frequencies and rejected the chaotic noise of industry. There are letters between factory owners and government officials discussing this exact problem. A Manchester mill owner wrote to Parliament in 1821 complaining that workers from religious districts, areas with active bell therapy programs, were unsuited to modern manufacture and overly delicate in constitution. He requested intervention to correct this impediment to progress. 6 months later, the bell removal programs began. That timing raises questions. Were the bells removed to make populations more compatible with industrial labour? Did someone decide that human health was less important than economic output, and that the acoustic environment needed to change to accommodate machines instead of biology? But there's another possibility, one that goes deeper. The bells might have been doing more than healing bodies. They might have been affecting consciousness, affecting how people think, how they perceive, what they can access mentally. There are accounts scattered through journals and letters from the period of people experiencing unusual mental states during bell therapy sessions, spontaneous visions, geometric patterns appearing in closed-eye visualization, feelings of expansion beyond the body. One account from a Cologne physician in 1810 describes patients achieving clarity of metaphysical perception and communion with essential principles during treatment. This wasn't described as religious ecstasy. It was documented as a side effect of the acoustic treatment, a predictable, reproducible side effect. The physician noted that it occurred most reliably when patients were positioned at specific nodal points in the standing wave patterns, the geometric centers of the sound structures. If the bells were activating states of consciousness beyond normal waking awareness, if they were giving ordinary people access to perception usually reserved for mystics and adepts, that represents a threat to control systems. A population that can access expanded states of consciousness independently is harder to manage, harder to direct, harder to keep focused on labor and consumption. There's a reason meditation was preserved only in monastic settings for centuries, a reason sacred sound practices were kept within priesthoods, a reason the mystery schools were closed and their techniques scattered. Knowledge that liberates consciousness is knowledge that undermines authority. The bells might have been a widespread, publicly accessible technology for consciousness expansion disguised as medical treatment. And in 1822, someone decided that technology needed to end, not just regulated, ended, erased, forgotten. They almost succeeded, almost, but not completely, because there are still traces, still fragments, still bells that survived. The Erfurt bell still hangs, it's not used, it's a museum piece now, but it exists. The Cologne Cathedral salvaged 3 of its original bells by hiding them during the removal period. They're in storage, not rung. The Saint. Petersburg Bell Archive contains 17 pre-1822 bells from churches across Europe, collected by a Russian prince who recognized what was being destroyed. Modern acoustic engineers have analyzed these survivors. The frequencies they produce don't match any contemporary bell. The harmonic overtone series extends into ranges our instruments can barely detect. When played, they create standing wave patterns that persist longer than physics says they should. The sound doesn't dissipate naturally. It sustains, it builds, it forms structures in space. One research team in Munich tried to replicate the effect. They cast a bell using surviving foundry notes, including the meteoritic iron, the gold trace elements, the exact copper-tin ratio. They followed the lunar timing, the temperature protocols, everything documented. The bell they produced created the standing wave effect. Not as strong as the originals, but measurable, reproducible, real. They published their findings in an obscure acoustics journal in 2003. The paper got almost no attention. The research program lost its funding the following year. The replica bell was donated to a museum where it's displayed as a curiosity. It's never been rung publicly. This pattern keeps repeating. Whenever someone gets close to understanding what those bells really were, what they really did, the research stops. The funding disappears. The results get buried in archives nobody reads. But the knowledge is still there. The bells still exist. The frequencies can still be measured. The effects can still be replicated. We just have to ask why we're not supposed to. Why this particular piece of history is presented as quaint superstition instead of suppressed technology. Why the removal happens so fast, so completely and so coordinated that it suggests centralized planning rather than organic social change. The official story is that we got smarter. We moved past superstition into scientific medicine. But scientific medicine today uses ultrasound therapy, which is just high-frequency sound waves applied to tissue. It uses vibration therapy for bone growth. It's exploring biofield resonance and frequency-based treatments. We're rediscovering what was allegedly superstition, rebranding it as innovation, and pretending we invented it. Maybe we didn't get smarter. Maybe we got amnesia. Induced amnesia, a deliberate forgetting enforced through the destruction of evidence and the ridicule of memory. The bells are gone. The towers are demolished, the medical texts are locked away. But the physics hasn't changed. Sound still creates vibration. Vibration still affects biology. Frequency still matters. The question isn't whether the bells worked, The evidence says they did. The question is why someone needed us to forget that they worked. What happens to a society when healing frequencies fill the acoustic environment versus when the dominant sounds are machinery, traffic, and electronic noise? What happens to consciousness when you remove the tones that activate expanded awareness and replace them with frequencies that keep you focused on survival and production? In 1822, they stripped the towers, they melted the bells, they burned the books. But they didn't change the physics, they didn't change what sound can do to living tissue. They just changed what we're allowed to remember about it. And if you're watching this and something in you recognizes that as true, you're starting to remember. Subscribe if you want to keep remembering, because there's more they don't want you to know. Next week I'm covering what happened to architectural resonance chambers after 1850, the hidden rooms in old buildings that amplified specific frequencies, why they're all sealed now, why the blueprints disappeared. It connects directly to this. The video on screen breaks down the frequency ranges used in pre-modern healing systems and what modern science is quietly rediscovering. Watch it. The pattern becomes obvious once you see it.